Welcome to Baddest Ballers. Please be sure to subscribe for more NBA analysis and content. Thank you so much for joining me. This is Clint, and this is the first ever episode of the Baddest Ballers podcast. Hoping to keep you entertained. Today, I'm going to be discussing Hall of Fame potential players. That is, players who should maybe make the Hall of Fame, players who are commonly discussed as Hall of Fame snubs, and I'm gonna just run through these guys and discuss who I think should make it and maybe should not make it, and go over my reasons why. Okay, so first we have on this list probably one of the more interesting entries here for me, Ben Wallace, aka Big Ben. We're talking about a guy who was undrafted, played 15 years in the league. Definitely not known for his offense at all. There's definitely, I don't think, too much debate in the basketball fandom on this one. Most people think that Ben Wallace is a shoo-in and should already be in the Hall of Fame. And there are definitely some good arguments for that. He was a four-time All-Star, rather, five-time All-NBA, four-time Defensive Player of the Year. Only player other than Dikembe Mutombo to achieve that. Obviously, part of the 2004 infamous Pistons team, championship team. Led the league in rebounding twice, six-time All-Defensive player. Led the league in blocks in the 2001-02 season. Definitely a defensive monster. Obviously, the biggest argument against Ben Wallace is the the one-sided nature of his game. Obviously, one of the best defensive players ever. Pretty much no offensive game. On the other hand, we're talking about a guy whose career high in points per game is still a shade under 10 points per game. Shockingly, though, he has actually made 7 3-pointers out of 51 attempts in his career. I'm not sure which of those shocked me more, the fact that he made 7 or that he attempted 51 of them, especially considering his egregiously poor free throw shooting. He had just nothing resembling a post game offensively. Anything that he got was mostly putbacks, open layups, stuff like that, dunks. Definitely had no ability to put two moves together. But on the defensive end, we're talking about a guy with amazing post defense, decent foot speed. I wouldn't call him switchable exactly, but he could hang with smaller players for sure. And again, in the post defensively, he was just great at cutting guys off. When guys try to come into the lane with trap steps or up and unders, just really amazing defensively, and he doesn't really have a comp as far as other NBA players. And one of the ways that you can do the whole Hall of Fame argument is you can do we get it, there are guys in the Hall of Fame right now who probably shouldn't be in there. Let's just ignore that. Look at the merit of his game as is. Should he be in the Hall of Fame? We could also look at it as, okay, historically speaking, these types of players have gotten in. Does Ben Wallace fit that prototype? There really isn't anyone to compare him to that I can think of. There are definitely defensive specialists, none that rise to his level, and none that was quite as one-dimensional as he was. I think the closest would be we're looking at Rodman or Mutombo. But even Rodman was a much better rebounder than Ben Wallace. And Ben Wallace was a much better rim protector than Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman is in the Hall of Fame, and Ben Wallace does have more win shares, 93.5 versus Rodman's 89.8. But again, the one-sided nature of his game, it comes back to that. Rodman didn't do much better offensively than Ben Wallace, but that was mostly by choice. Dennis Rodman did have something resembling an offensive game. Ben Wallace just really he would be the last person I would want to pass the ball to. I would just never pass him the ball if I were his point guard. And also, it doesn't really get mentioned too much. Ben Wallace is listed at 6'9". I personally think he's closer to 6'8". Seeing him stand next to guys like LeBron James and Tracy McGrady. Could be wrong on that. I do think he's closer to 6'8". Does have that solid muscular frame, but definitely nothing like the huge wide body of like a Karl Malone. But he is pretty strong and solid. And don't know what his wingspan is. Couldn't find it. Maybe someone could share that information with me on Twitter. But he definitely didn't have, just eyeballing it, he didn't have a crazy wingspan. He definitely didn't have the longest arms. That's not what drove his rim protecting ability. He was more so an explosive jumper and had excellent timing around the rim, sort of would feel out the guy that he was defending and just perfectly time their jumps. He was just great at feeling out whoever was going up against him in the post. Definitely what made him a defensive specialist and amazing defensively. And so the big question, does he belong in the Hall of Fame? Ultimately, I think it's really difficult to make the argument that a 4-time Defensive Player of the Year does not belong in the Hall of Fame. You can harp on his lack of offensive game, and I certainly respect that argument. But 4-time Defensive Player of the Year, all defensive team 6 times, does have a championship ring. I don't know if that should count too much, but he does have a championship. 5-time All NBA. So I mean, this is a guy who was in his peak was one of the best players in the league, even without an offensive game. And I think that does count for something. He's definitely not, making any top 10 of all time lists, top 20, not even top 50. But Hall of Fame is a lot broader than that, and it's definitely difficult to discount his accomplishments. So Ben Wallace, I think, should be in the Hall of Fame. Okay, so next up we have Chris Webber, aka C-Web, and this is a player who, sort of like Ben Wallace, there's a lot of consensus that he should already be in the Hall of Fame. He's considered a shoo-in, and he's been snubbed. And there's some evidence to suggest that you can make a case for him. He was a 5-time All-Star. He won Rookie of the Year. Even led the league in rebounding in the 98-99 season. 5 All-NBA selections. C-Web was definitely no slouch as far as NBA talents go. There are some arguments against him as well. He definitely was not that great defensively, and he was not a superstar offensive talent. He was definitely very talented offensively, but he wasn't exactly game-changing, generational level offensively, which I'm not saying you need to be to get into the Hall of Fame, but because he wasn't exactly a stopper on the other end, I mean, for me personally, I would prefer that his offense, he had more of an offensive game to sort of compensate for that. He's definitely not going to get in for his college accomplishments as a member of the Fab Five for obvious reasons. We all know about his involvement in the Ed Martin scandal. C-Web at his peak, we're talking a guy who averaged 27 points per game at his absolute offensive peak and had a career average of 20 points a game, 20.7 to be exact, which is pretty good. The thing that troubles me as far as making a case for him in the Hall of Fame is that when you sort of look at other big men, and don't get me wrong, KG is definitely, widely acknowledged should be in another level, and C-Web. But if you look at KG, for example, he actually, and this surprised me, his career usage rate is lower than C Webb's, and his all around numbers are superior to C Webb. He was definitely, without question, a far better player, and he needed the ball less to have more of an impact. Which, to me, that tells me a lot, and I think that C Webb's ability to get buckets in his prime sort of gives him that edge where a lot of people feel like he's being snubbed. There's definitely an offensive bias when it comes to Hall of Fame selections, which is why, even though most people would agree probably that Ben Wallace should be in the Hall of Fame, there isn't as much outrage. He wasn't putting up 20 points a game. And there's definitely this bias towards offensive players where if you're putting up 20 points a game, you're somebody in the league. You're a star, you're an all-star, you're a superstar, whatever the case may be. But you're going to be coveted more so than defensive specialists. And it's I don't know. I think both ends of the ball should be considered, not necessarily equally. I do understand that it's probably more difficult to lead your team offensively than to be the lockdown guy. So I that's something that I take into consideration. But again, looking at C Webb's numbers, if you look at his VORP, which is value of a replacement player, stats, his best year would rank 9th for KG, which is absolutely insane to me. We're just talking levels here, right? Like absolute levels. You would think most people would agree, obviously, KG is better than C Webb, but I think most people would just sort of like, yeah, well, KG is better. I don't know that most people would acknowledge that KG is so much better, and I think the numbers support that KG is so much better, which is why KG is in the Hall of Fame, clearly. But if as far as the Hall of Fame argument for C Webb, this is a tough one for me, and I'm gonna go with the whole split decision thing that I mentioned before. So if we're looking at historically who is in the Hall of Fame and what type of players have gotten in, then yeah, I'm going to have to give it to C Webb. I think you can definitely make a case for him being in the Hall of Fame if you consider who has already made it. Now, if we're just talking, you know what? We already have some bad selections in there. We're going to start fresh from now and only consider the merits of players going forward. It's going to be tough, but I would actually leave him out just because I think when you consider that he was a high usage player, he wasn't the best shooter. His win share numbers not impressive. Actually, funny enough, speaking of win shares, Basketball Reference does have a similarity score, and he has a 91.8 similarity score to Ben Wallace, with 100 being the max on that, that is interesting, considering that he's an offensive player, Ben Wallace is a defensive player primarily. But yeah, I would leave him out based strictly on what he did over the course of his career and the fact that he needed the ball as much as he did to do it. But if I had to consider who else is in there, I would give it to C Webb, because there are definitely players that I think he's definitely had more of an impact than a lot of guys that are in the Hall of Fame currently. Another interesting name that gets tossed around a lot is actually Antawn Jamison. This one is interesting to me from the perspective of I'm not really entirely sure why. And this is no disrespect to Antawn Jamison. He definitely had a really good career. Played a bit of 4, a bit of 3, 6'8", 6'9", depending on the source. Good size, good length, definitely switchable. Get you buckets, could create his own shot if he needed to. So Antawn Jamison, we're talking about a two-time All-Star, 98-99 Rookie of the Year, 03-04 Sixth Man of the Year, 20,000 career points. And that's pretty much the highlight of his career. 18.5 points per game career average. So he was definitely no slouch, obviously. The problem with the Antawn Jamison case is that, again, 2 All-Star selections, no All-NBA selections. This was a guy who was above average offensively, and for most of his career was basically just to under the All-Star level, peak of his career, two-time All-Star. So this is a guy that I would be glad to have him on my team, probably as a sixth man or as a pretty good starting 3, even a 4 in today's game, honestly. He did play some 4 during his career anyway. But he's not, Antawn Jamison is not, he's not really worthy of serious contention for a Hall of Fame in my opinion. And again, that's no disrespect to Antawn Jamison. Definitely a very skilled offensive player. Wasn't especially impactful on the defensive end. Not saying that he played matador defense by any means. He wasn't the worst, wasn't the best. Decent hands, decent foot speed, even some decent post defense. But again, and that's actually the thing about Antawn Jamison, as I'm using the word decent a lot. He was sort of a jack of all trades, master of none. He wasn't really going to excel in any area of the court. He's not known for any one thing per se. He was an above average offensive player. That's really about it. Not too much to say here for Antawn Jamison. Though I definitely was a fan of his game, and he was pretty well respected around the league when he did play. I think he's actually just best well known for scoring 50 points back to back. If I remember that correctly, someone let me know if I'm wrong. I'm going off of memory here, but I do remember that being like a moment in his career. But other than that, no serious Hall of Fame consideration for Antawn Jamison. Even if really you look at past guys, still would be a really weak argument for getting him in there, and definitely not if you just go off of the merits of his contributions on the court as a player. All right, let's talk about the Matrix, and of course I mean Shawn Marion. Shawn Marion, his case is a bit more. It's a bit tighter. It's a bit more up in the air than the other players that I've mentioned so far. Shawn Marion is also a jack of all trades, so to speak. But unlike Antawn Jamison, for example, Shawn Marion's game was a bit more balanced. He could get you 15 points a game, but he also, on the defensive end, even though he was only 6'7", undersized for the 4 position, which he played primarily, even though he did play some small forward as well. Was a pretty decent rim protector, had some decent post defense, and like I said before, could also get you some buckets on the offensive end. Obviously, his time in the Suns, with the Suns, rather, when he played with Nash, helped his game. And you could definitely attribute a lot of his success to Nash. Nash was a boon for a lot of the players that he played with. However, it's not like Shawn Marion was some totally interchangeable piece as long as Nash is a point guard. Shawn Marion did have a fairly unique set of skills. Again, especially at his size, he was so perfect for that system. You could almost think of Shawn Marion as like Draymond Green if you balanced out the sliders a bit. So he's not quite the defensive genius that Draymond is, but he also offensively is more versatile than Draymond and can do some things on the offensive end that Draymond Green can't. Shawn Marion, he's not a shooter. Shot 33% from the 3-point line for his career, and field goal percentage was at 48%, and that's despite mostly playing closer to the rim. And the funny thing about making the case for Shawn Marion for the Hall of Fame is that if I was going strictly off of my memory, watching him play, and I did watch him play quite a bit. There's certain things that you remember incorrectly when you go back and you look at the numbers and you rewatch some footage. You realize it's interesting how things get distorted. I sort of remember him as a shooter with an ugly shot, but it went in, and if it's not broke, don't fix it. The numbers don't bear that out. he was not a shooter at all. He really should not have been shooting, but he really didn't shoot that much either, which is interesting, because I definitely do remember him as a shooter. But in either event, for Shawn, if you take a deep dive at most of his numbers, like I said, nothing that's going to scream Hall of Famer at you. He did make the All-Star team on 4 occasions, won the Rookie of the Year, even had 2 All-NBA selections. So this is a guy whose peak was higher than, say, an Antawn Jamison's. You can say that he was his game, his impact on the court was definitely a level up from someone like Antawn Jamison. I'm not totally sold on Shawn Marion as a Hall of Famer, but the argument can be made. He's not a no-brainer for sure. That goes without saying. He's not one of the top level guys like Kobe Bryant, Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, those guys where it's like you would never have this conversation. They're in the Hall of Fame, period. That's it. No discussion. For Shawn Marion, the discussion, I think, needs to be had. But ultimately, when you look at like his win shares, he has 124.9 for his career. That's pretty good. This is telling you, to me, he had an impact on the court. It's just that with being so versatile, his impact is sort of spread out across several metrics. He wasn't an amazing scorer. He wasn't an amazing rim protector. He wasn't an amazing perimeter defender. But he did all of those things better than most players. And his peak was also better than the typical, I'm an all-star but not a superstar player. And he was not a superstar himself, but the combination of having a good, consistent career along with a great peak, I think just gets him in there. As far as whether or not he will ever actually make the Hall of Fame, that's tough to say. Basketball Reference seems to like him, giving him like a 75% chance to get into the Hall of Fame. That seems a bit optimistic to me. If I had to guess, I would put it more at like 60%. But I do think that ultimately the argument can be made, and he just gets in there based on what he's accomplished throughout his career. In general, honestly, I do suspect that his game and his contributions to the game will be increasingly forgotten in the annals of history as time passes. But Peja Stojakovic actually had a pretty good career. Like I did mention, pretty good shooter. He averaged 40% from 3 on 5.5 attempts over his career. And definitely, in today's game, he's a guy that would have been shooting more. And actually, over the course of his career, the numbers bear out, interestingly enough, that as his volume increased, so did his efficiency. So he made more the more he shot, and I think it would just be interesting to see him if he were just now coming in the league today with more of a green light to shoot. Even though he wasn't shy about shooting it when he did play, but I just think it would be a different there would be more of a green light. He would do more of an emphasis on him taking that shot from outside. I think he would do really well in today's game, and maybe in today's game, he would be a shoo-in, or he would have a more pronounced argument for making the Hall of Fame if he had been starting his career just about now rather than having ended it about 10 years ago. He was also a guy that didn't turn the ball over a lot. Excellent from the free throw line. Shot 89.5%. From there, even though he didn't really get to the line a lot, he wasn't a slasher. Again, so he didn't really get to make that much of an impact from the free throw line, but he was an excellent shooter pretty much everywhere on the court. He averaged 24 points per game at his peak. Just absolute insane scoring ability. 17 points per game on his career average. And like I said, didn't turn the ball over a lot. One of the biggest things that hurt his case, though, is that he only played 12 years. I actually didn't realize till I looked this up for this podcast that he ended his career at age 33 after sneaking in there and getting that championship with the Mavericks. But the length of his career is probably the biggest thing hurting his case. He is a 3-time All-Star, made an All-NBA team in 03-04 season. For a Hall of Famer, you either want to see more accomplishments or sort of sustained excellence over a longer period of time. Like again, 12 years, not that long of a career. It's long enough to make the Hall of Fame, but for 12 years, you typically want to see someone who's on the next level, a top tier player. He's not a top tier player. Peja Stojakovic could be at his peak, the absolute peak of his career. He was good enough to be a number one option, but even then, he wasn't good enough to be the number one option on a championship team. He was never, at any point in his career, was he that guy. He was never the guy that could take a team to a championship. At least not as the main guy, as a second or third option. If Peja is your third option, you have a dangerous team, and that I would envy playing that team at his peak as a third option. I would not envy that team, rather. So for me, it's again, going with the split decision, he doesn't quite make it on either account. I don't think there are too many guys where you can, in the Hall of Fame currently, where you can look at it and say, okay, he's in there, Peja needs to be in there. Maybe it's debatable. I don't know. But going off of the merits of what he accomplished on the court and factoring in the fact that he only played 12 years, again, it's borderline. I sort of see him as an all-star level talent for most of his career, even though he only made 3 all-stars. But he was definitely never a superstar. And for someone who was not a superstar to only have played 12 seasons, I'm keeping him out by just a bit. He definitely had the talent and the ability to be a Hall of Fame level player. Circumstances just didn't necessarily work out in his favor for that to happen. All right, now last but not least, we have KJ, aka Mayor Johnson, Kevin Johnson. And speaking of short careers, he only played 11 years. So right off the bat, that does work against KJ. What does work in his favor, though, he was a 3-time All-Star, made an All-NBA team on 5 different occasions. In the 88-89 season, he was most improved. And his win shares for his career, looking at 92.8, 9.1 assists per game over the course of his career, which if I remember correctly, it was somewhere up there. I believe he's in the top 10 in terms of average, and I know in terms of total assists, he's 24th overall. So sustained excellence in his peak. Again, he did have a short career, and he tailed off quite a bit towards the end of his career. So the argument for Kevin Johnson really is kind of iffy. His peak is debatably higher than almost anyone, if not anyone else, already discussed on this list. He unquestionably, just like Peja Stojakovic, unquestionably Hall of Fame level talent. The talent is without question here. What holds him back is the duration of career. He did only play 11 years, like previously mentioned. The strongest argument in his favor is that he did make 5 All-NBA teams. That's not quite strong enough to be an automatic shoo-in, for sure. But his assist numbers are excellent. He was a very efficient player, 58.5% true shooting percentage for his career. That's pretty good. Now you could also make the argument that it's easier to have a higher true shooting percentage when you have a shorter career. But I'm willing to bet, especially if I go through point guard numbers and I look at their best 10, 11 years, most players aren't going to approach that number. That's just me going off the top. I haven't actually looked into that. I could be wrong. But he was pretty efficient. Not a 3 shooter. Only shot 30% from 3 for his career. But I think overall impact on the court, and with him having probably a higher peak than most on this list, I would put him in by just a little bit. Realistically, I don't think that he actually will ever make the Hall of Fame. Maybe unless there's an extremely weak class one year and they're just sort of, going through potential old candidates that were overlooked, he might slide in there. Realistically, I don't actually see him getting into the Hall of Fame. And it's not outrageous to me either if he never gets in. But I think an argument can be made that he could be placed in the Hall of Fame based mostly off of his accomplishments at the absolute peak of his career. And for a 6'1", 180 guy, he was definitely able to have an impressive impact. Not, definitely not quite the talent that Isaiah Thomas or Allen Iverson were, or even Nate Tiny Archibald, but for sure, a player who was able to get to his spots, very skilled offensively, decent defensively, though obviously, not the best one-on-one stopper, but overall totality, I think he's a sneak in. You can put him in there, but it's not highway robbery if he never gets into the Hall of Fame either. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in to the first ever episode of the Baddest Ballers podcast. Appreciate your support. I am thinking about making a similar video for the YouTube channel wherein I specifically break down what I think should be the criteria for Hall of Fame entry. That way, there's less argument and less confusion about who should be in the Hall of Fame and who should be excluded. Let me know if that's something that you guys might be interested in. If you enjoy the content, please consider supporting on Patreon. That's patreon.com/baddestballers. Any tier that you can contribute or feel comfortable contributing at on a consistent basis, truly appreciated. No amount too big or too small. I appreciate all of you, and stay ballin'.